An organization with high data volume workloads have successfully moved to DynamoDB after having many issues with traditional database systems. However, a few months into production, Dynamo tables are consistently recording high latency. Which of the following would you suggest to reduce the latency? Select 2. Reduce connection pooling, which keeps the connections alive even when user requests aren't present, therefore blocking the services. Use DAX for business with heavy write-only workloads. Use eventually consistent reads instead of strongly consistent reads when possible. Consider using global tables if your app is accessed by globally distributed users. Increase the request timeout setting so the client gets enough time to complete the request, therefore reducing retries on the system. All right. Consider using global tables if your app is accessed by globally distributed users, and use eventually consistent reads in place of strongly consistent reads. All right, and then we have a couple of wrong answer explanations. Masking the problem. Increasing timeout settings might hide the symptoms without solving them. Okay, so we're not interested in, okay. And the connection pooling helps in efficiently managing connections to the database by reusing existing connections instead of, so that doesn't really help us with this situation. Okay. A company wants to implement authentication for its new RESTful API service that uses API Gateway to authenticate the calls. Each request must include HTTP headers with a client ID and user ID. These credentials must be compared to the authentication data in a DynamoDB table. Which of the following would you recommend for implementing this authentication in API Gateway? Authorize using Cognito that will reference authentication table of DynamoDB. Develop Lambda authorizer that references the authentication data in the DynamoDB table. Set up an API Gateway model that requires credentials and grant API Gateway access to the authentication table of DynamoDB. Update the API Gateway integration requests to require the credentials, then grant API Gateway access to the authentication table in DynamoDB. Okay, develop Lambda authorizer that references the authentication in the table. Lambda authorizers are custom authors that allow you to use a Lambda function to authenticate API requests. Okay. All right, we got one wrong answer. Setting up an API Gateway model that requires credentials and granting API to that is not the ideal for set. Okay, so it could pose security risks. Okay, nice. As a developer, you are working on a mobile application that utilizes SQS for sending messages to downstream systems for further processing. One of the requirements is that the messages should be stored in the queue for a period of 12 days. How will you configure this requirement? Enable long polling for the SQS queue. The max retention period SQS message is 7 days, therefore retention period of 12 days isn't possible. Change the queue message retention setting. Use a FIFO SQS queue. All right. Change the queue message retention setting. I guess that's pretty straightforward. Okay, well, let's do one more. You are a developer working at a cloud company that embraces serverless. You have performed your initial deployment and would like to work towards adding API Gateway stages and associate them with existing deployments. Your stages will include production, test, and will need to match a Lambda function variant that can be updated over time. Which of the following features must you add to achieve this? Select 2. Lambda X-ray integration, stage variables, Lambda versions, mapping templates, Lambda aliases. Okay, let's see. Stage variables and Lambda to the specific users can access function version using the alias ARN. Okay, that's good. Versions are immutable and cannot be updated over time. So, okay. All right, stop everything.